Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dave Deptula, AFA's Dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, and welcome to our Aerospace Nation speaker series. We're really pleased today that Lieutenant General Scott Catfish Rice could join us. General Rice is the Director of the Air National Guard. He's responsible for formulating, developing, and coordinating all policy plans and programs affecting more than 105,000 Guard members and civilians in more than 175 geographically separated units. So welcome, Scott, and thanks very much for taking the time to join us today. I'd like to start off by giving you some time to give us a rundown on issues that you're working as the Director of the Air Guard, and more importantly, as a key leader in the greater total Air Force. So over to you, Catfish.
Okay, sir, and Dave, thanks a lot for one, your leadership in the Mitchell Institute, and then two, for hosting all these different forums and events, and the number of senior leaders you've had on. I'm very humbled and honored to be included in that group and be part of the adventure that we're all on. How do we build for a better tomorrow using the things we have today. And including me in that group is pretty special for me personally, but professionally, I'm truly honored. So thank you very much for all you do and all you do for me personally. But speaking about the Air Guard, there's a lot of stuff going on lately. In fact, for perspective-wise, percentage-wise, this over the last few months, this is the largest activation of the National Guard really since World War II. We have almost 28% of the National Guard, Army and Air, on duty of some kind, either overseas or in stateside events. And so it's been pretty impressive. A total number of about 120,000, of which the Air Guard is about 20,000 of that. Typical ratio, typical numbers, especially with us not heavily engaged overseas, certainly engaged, but not heavily, mainly doing stateside support and movement of people and troops and things like that, and all the stuff that the Guard's been doing in our communities with COVID. But if I could step you back in time a little bit, I started in this business as a director of the Air Guard 4 years ago, and was leveraging the experience and the time from some big events that we had where DoD came under tremendous pressure to reduce the budget in 2010, 2013 timeframe. Bud Wyatt, the director, then worked through. So how do we appropriately add Air Guard to the mix of what the Air Force is doing, and really taking almost a 10% cut in a fiscal year, which is really hard. And the only way you can really do that is people and right out of the ops maintenance O&M commands. Like USAFE, PACAF, and the Guard. And then from that time period, that really brought a laser focus on the Guard and the value to America. The value that we're not just a strategic reserve, we're an operational reserve, meaning that with 30% of the Guard full-time and 70% or so, of 2/3 of the Guard part-time, it's a very cost-effective operational reserve that is there, ready, willing, and able to not only do things overseas, but stateside. And in light of that, since 9/11, if you add up all the deployments of every time somebody was activated and sent overseas and back, we're in the order magnitude of 650,000 Air Guardsmen have been activated. Many of them several times. In fact, I've deployed overseas a half dozen times myself into combat situations. But since then, over 650,000 Guardsmen have been activated and used, and then brought home from the deployments. So as we go from there into the next stage, which is Sid Clark, he was the director before myself, and then he worked with a staff to have the right balance of programming and operations and mix, and then that system was handed to me. And one of the things I've worked on pretty hard is, in light of our priorities, our three big Air Guard priorities of readiness for today's fight, building the strength of our 21st century Guard Airmen to be relevant, reliable, and an active part of the today's fight with the same equipment and compatible procedures, and we all follow the same standards, and then present that force and build for tomorrow's fight as well. So today's fight with readiness, our 21st century Guard airmen, and then build and organize for tomorrow's fight. And in light of that, my focus has been on primarily streamlining the mobilization process. Because I hear terms like, hey, the Guard's not accessible. When we need you, you're not there, you're not available. And that's a hard task sometimes, because when the president calls or the SecDef calls, we're ready to go. Congress adds the funding into that requirement, and off we go. And we're very, very accessible as an operational reserve. But to do operations on the MAGCOM level, as they try to understand and be a part of the value to the combat commands and the nation on what they need, we're in an era where a large presence and a large show of force is very influential, with places like keeping the calm in China and the Pacific, keeping Russia in check on our high-end fight, and then at the same time, deflecting, deferring terrorism, and making an impact there. That we talk the talk and then we walk the walk. And when we walk the walk, and you want to have the presence, the forward presence, and a MAGCOM and a COCOM get together and say, hey, let's build our presence and assure partners and allies, that's a hard place for the Guard to operate, because we're not in an operation, we're not really in an exercise, but with a named operation and even a named exercise, we do have authorities, but not necessarily all the money. So the accessibility comes in the process. How do we get the money in the right place at the right time? And the specific process of the mobilization process. Now, Congress added value to the Guard and the Reserve component, saying, hey, to get people ready with medical and things like that, if you get orders in hand to go in an operation or an exercise, or specifically an operation under mobilization authorities, you can get benefits, and really the key is dental and medical benefits 180 days prior to your deployment. And that really builds the strength of, hey, getting people over the hump into, hey, I'm there, but I'm just not. I need that final push to get medically ready, dental ready, physically ready, maybe training ready, and that flows resources at the 180-day point. Now, that said, with things like the SDA being signed by the SecDef on the presentation of forces to COCOMs in January, and our deployment start in October or a few months prior, that is a challenge for us to run through the process and get ahead. So we've done some things recently over the last year or so to empower commanders to be able to add names and subtract names at the local level rather than at the MAGCOM level. We've streamlined and automated the process that if we put a name, social security number in, the system now data mines their data, pulls it up, and we're able to publish orders not in 45 days, but about 3 days. And that's where the Army and the Army Reserve is. And we've taken their system and added it to our enterprise. And we're going to go online with that over the next 6 months. So being accessible is a key part of who we are for the 21st century. In the stateside arena, you can see that when a governor calls and he wants guardsmen on duty and out in the streets to calm and assure all our citizens and our neighbors and our friends, that process is pretty good, and the money flows relatively quickly, and accordingly you can see our response. But on the overseas side, we're getting better. We started out with an average of almost 90 days prior getting orders in hand, which is half of what we really need. And we're getting and tipping the scale now to 145 days, 150, and our goal is soon to get orders in hand 180 days prior, and that allows us to be very accessible to the MAGCOMs, COCOMs, and our nation when they call. So I'd like to conclude my remarks with that and say I'm at the end of my career in the Air Force. I hit 40 years of service in May, and I was extended by the president, much to my surprise, for a couple of months to help with the COVID-19 response. And so I'll officially retire and join you in the ranks of those wise and very, very influential graybeards, as we call them, are honorable members of our Corps that have served. On 1 August, I'll be retiring. So it's been quite a career and quite an opportunity for me. And I'm about 20 years farther along than I ever thought I would be, but it's been quite an adventure, quite a ride. Back to you, Dave.
You bet. Well, thanks very much, Catfish, for that context and insight, and huge congratulations on simply a magnificent career. And thanks for all that you've done, as well as your team, to ensure that the Air National Guard's prepared to deploy and fight if called upon to do so. As you mentioned, over your 40-year career, seems like the challenge is just getting more daunting than ever before. And at the same time, the Air Force is smaller and older than it's ever been. So it needs to boldly step into the future. Actually, we saw that first step yesterday with the confirmation of our next Air Force Chief of Staff, General C.Q. Brown. And of course, the Air National Guard is pivotal to that future. So let's jump into a little more detail.
Okay.
Scott, COVID-19 has dominated the attention of the Defense Department, as well as the entire nation. Could you elaborate a bit on how COVID-19 has affected the ability of traditional guardsmen to be ready to respond if called? And are you seeing any difference in how the COVID virus and measures to limit the speed of the spread affect traditional guardsmen compared to active duty forces and full-time guardsmen?
Right, and great question, very relevant to today, because come March, actually, if you look back at February, as recent as February, in 1,000 years, I never thought we'd be where we are right now, either as a nation or as a military. And so if you look at it, probably 90% of the response of military in our communities for COVID has been from the Guard, and then the next is from the reserves. And we've deployed in all 50 states, the 3 territories, and the District of Columbia. So as I call it, the 54. We are out and about in the 54 with almost 45,000 guardsmen. And of that, roughly about 5,000 have been Air Guard. And we've done some things you never would think of. We normally have been there for crowd control, if that's the case. In this case, it's not about crowds, but it's just about servicing the public in other ways. Things like food distribution, when the system starts to break down in areas where the truck drivers, due to COVID, were out sick, or public safety with all the people in uniform, from law enforcement to fire to emergency rescue, where they had a COVID run through their ranks, and we would augment the force in various places. And then doing things like testing. And we've done 1.5 million tests with guardsmen across the country.
Wow.
of testing. And in light of all of that, the Air Force is roughly in the magnitude, about 400 people have been affected. And the Guard is roughly in the magnitude about 300 people affected. And the Guard is, as you said, 105, we've grown to 107,500 now. And the Guard's 100,000 roughly. The Air Force is roughly 340,000. And so at that size, we almost have the same number of infected. But if you look at the world and the population in our communities, that's less than 0.25% of our Guard have been affected. So we've been very, very proactive with distributing, using PPE, and just as simple as it may sound, simple hygiene with people, and teaching them, it's not just a quick pass of water across your hands, it's actually washing your hands, things like that, not touching your hand to your face, having a mask on to help stop that, has really, really been effective. And so we've been, this is in the heart of what we do as a business, because if you look at the SecDef's priorities, his stuff is protect the Defense Departments, maintain readiness, and then support whole of government. And we're in all of that, but the support of whole of government and interagency response, we're deep into that with our towns, communities, and in our states and providing our response. It's been pretty amazing to me to see the Guard in action, and see what we can do when the nation calls. Back to you, Dave.
Yeah, well, thanks. That's a helpful perspective for future planning. A bit of a follow-up. How's it been going with recruiting during the last few months? And what are you doing projecting for recruiting in the next year?
So right now, a timely question, because I just got a recruiting update no later than this morning. So with our numbers at 107,500 as our authorized strength, we're going to hit about 1,000 short of that at the end of this year. And interesting, we've had a change in dynamic that I hadn't seen before, that we're digging into and finding out what it means. And I'll tell you by this. Our recruiting is actually increasing slightly. So our recruiting numbers and what we're trying to recruit has been better than normal. So we're doing okay. Our retention has changed for the first time in probably 10 years. And I think that as people try to balance and predict where they're going to be in the future, and they balance their home life, their work life in the civilian market, and their military life, I think people are struggling and challenging with all of this activation. And in COVID-19, it's this rolling. Are we ahead of it yet? No, let's add another month. I mean, we had orders in hand in March and April just for 30 days, 31 days, and then those were extended to the end of May and to the end of June, and now we have the authorization to extend them through August. And that's pretty impactful on people as we look to the future. So retention is down, and because retention's down, we're going to be 1,000 short. We're the same as the reserves, and the active duty. Accordingly, their retention is about the same, and so their recruiting is up slightly, and they're going to meet end strength. So the active will meet, and the Guard and Reserve will be less than end strength.
Well, you and I have lived through a number of cycles with pilot retention. Just as the roaring economy was a pull factor for Air Force pilots to separate, creating a long-term deficit of around 2,000 pilots or so, the airlines were hit really hard by the COVID-19 shutdown. Major airlines are operating in a limited capacity, having really reduced the number of commercial flights around the world as a result of demand. I mean, it makes sense. So as a result, a large number of recently separating pilots are in a gray zone, no airline jobs, and a limited plan for reabsorption into the active Air Force. Does the Guard plan to capture some of this precious talent?
Yes, and in fact, so if somebody's retired and they want to come back to service, the Guard uses a process called a finding of indispensable with their training from the past and indispensable to our service, and we can bring them back from retirement onto duty. Also, we have authorities to bring back those that have separated but haven't retired but separated, and that's an easier process. But this retired person process and to bring them back is something that I have limited authority from the Secretary of the Air Force to do some of that. I can't be over 100% and things like that. I have to make sure the numbers match. But what I asked the Secretary for was, hey, in light of the COVID for this pandemic response, can you give me greater authorities to bring back somebody for a year that I can rapidly fast track them? And we found out that if somebody has been out less than 2 years, we have the ability to bring them back relatively easy, quickly. We look at their medical security, do a quick check on those, and we get them rapidly up to speed if they have the right training. So she's delegated more authorities to me to be able to bring back those retired and bring back those that are indispensable with a fast track spot process, again, to look at their health, their training, where they've been, their security levels and security clearance, and bringing them back in our ranks. And that has helped with those that have separated, that are caught by this say airline turn. And it's not only pilots, but it's maintainers as well. And if you've and I know you've seen the news and what we're talking about with this storm from the airlines is still to come, because the amount of CARES Act bailout for the airlines, if they took the money, they couldn't furlough anyone until the fall, until September, October. So that is coming as we all figure out how much travel will come back, how much will not come back, and where the airlines will fall. No pun intended, in the fall, and then into the spring, whether COVID comes back or not. So the dynamic and the volatility of this market is huge. So with these authorities, we've been successfully starting to bring people back, or at least getting the word out and getting ready for this big storm that's coming probably in the fall. And in light of that, one other side of it is bringing people off of active duty. The retention is way up in the ops world and in ops and maintenance. It's down in other areas, as I already talked about, and balances out that we're losing more than we thought. But in ops and maintenance, our retention is very high right now, which is good.
Oh, geez, thanks for that insight. Some really fascinating facts there. Now, many in the public think the Air Guard as a reserve force waiting to be used in extremis situations. In fact, the Air Guard, as you mentioned in your earlier remarks, been deploying continuously since Desert Storm. Now that tempo has accelerated over the past 2 decades. Can you talk a bit about the impact of continuous deployments for the Air National Guard?
Yeah, it's been a challenge, and the impact is in our hands. We have two conflicting requirements. One is we want to be as flexible and adaptable as we can, because the COCOMs don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, next week, next month, and the COCOMs with MAJCOM support have to be ready and flexible to use a term I've heard, fight tonight, and that's a very very real thing when you look at options on deterrence. And if you're ready to fight tonight and the other guy knows that, then there's a great deterrent value in that, for keeping the calm and keeping the peace. That's the flexibility part. The other side of it is we do know when we're going to deploy. In a lot of cases, we do know where we're going to go 1 year out or 6 months out or even 2 years out. We know where the hotspots are. We know that the Middle East has still got a lot of engagements going on, and there'll be a lot of requirements. So that other side is the predictability of, hey, if we know we're going to go, can't we build a process, a plan, and put the forces and emotions in place? 180 days out is for the benefits piece I talked, but 9 months out, a year out is a place where predictability for our force is something we all desire, not only for the employers in a civilian market of our employees in the Guard, but primarily the members, the families. And this is no different than active duty. If you know I'm going to deploy in 6 months, why don't we start working on that now rather than make it a crisis 1 month out? That's an active duty issue, a Guard issue. And for us, though, the stress that absorbs that balance of flexibility and predictability is the families and the civilian employers. They absorb that, and that's where they give us pushback and saying, if you know this is coming, why don't we work constructively for that? So that's the challenge that we're working on. So my plan and my process to at least make the process faster, more efficient, and more locally controlled, to give people's orders in hand 180s is not just for the benefit. It's for this, hey, let's feed the predictability so we have a sustainable force for the long term. And that's really, really been helping. And we found we have a decrease in employer fatigue on allowing their Guardsmen to go when we give them more and more notice, longer distance prior. So that's actually been working in our favor.
Well, I tell you what, you're very familiar with the saying in the Guard that you're achieving the right balance between service, family, and employer if everyone's equally upset with you. So how about
Absolutely.
how about a temperature check there? How do the employers and the families, what are their perspectives today? Do you have any insights in that?
Yeah, a little bit. The employers are now not now, but they have always, and now as I take the pressure of predictability off and give them more notice, they get back to the basics that we all know is of value. When you have a military member that's been trained in the professionalism that they're trained in, their commitment, this this thing of service above self, serving something bigger than yourself, that's what employers want more than anything else. They want a commitment to their ideals, their company, and their way of life, and they pay for it, and they give you a benefit, and at the same time they want commitment, and that's the piece that we've found we're getting a greater resonance with our employers, and that's why I think the temperature with our employers is good and getting better. And again, it takes constant engagement by us in the leadership of the Guard, Air and Army, with our employers to let them know what we're doing now, what we're planning for tomorrow, and how we're going to employ the force. And that's been very helpful. Now, the family piece is interesting because particularly in COVID, I think they've been taking a lot of stress with this, where everybody's staying at home, locked in the almost, if I could say, locked in a cage. We kind of get on each other's nerves, and that's been a little stressful. But I think that's short term. I mean that will change for all of us. That's not just a military thing. That's our community thing, and we'll get beyond this, and we'll get through this, and we'll get to a better place. But long term, the recruits that we're bringing into the force now, you would think that, golly, 40, 50 years ago, height of Vietnam type era, was the Guard was a means and a way to not get drafted. And so it was a way to avoid service. In some cases, the Guard was. And wasn't used a lot, but was used somewhat. And now the shift I found is that the Guardsmen want to deploy. They want to be part of the fight. And their families are engaged with the service above ourselves. So though we like to thank our families for supporting us and all the things, I think they do significantly more than that. I know my wife serves right alongside of me just as much as I do. And in fact, we've one of the things we've tried to do with 90 wings and over 175 GSUs, geographically separated units, my wife and I and the command chief, and in some cases his wife, tried to visit every single wing in the Air National Guard. With 90 of them, I had to do a drill weekend every other week for 4 years to visit all 90 wings. And last December, Nancy and I finished it. In fact, she traveled all on her own dime, her own time, and everything to go visit the wings. So there was one big snowstorm in North Dakota, and she didn't make it. So she went to 89 wings, and I went to 90. So anyway, it was really pretty warming, and to talk to families and let them know that I recognize them and their service right alongside our members has been very, very telling, very important, and pretty honorable. People really like that. Oh,
Well, that's great. And congratulations to your wife that you as a pair define the term total force. Let's move the discussion up to a strategic level a bit.
okay.
And your thoughts on the fact that at one time the Air National Guard was truly a strategic reserve, but not really anymore for the reasons that you already discussed. Because given how small the regular Air Force is, the Air National Guard has to be factored into the fight from the start. So with no strategic reserve and every component of the total force effectively a fight tonight force, as you talked about, what are the implications for future planning? Should the active duty element be advocating for a higher level increase in personnel billets and get the Guard back to more? I mean, it'll never go back completely, but get it back to a greater degree of being a strategic reserve.
Yes, and I think I think as a second and third order effect of today's events, and specifically I'm talking about pandemic and COVID-19, a little bit about civil disturbance, when you have a force that is a strategic reserve as well as operational reserve, that gives our nation, our president, our Department of Defense options. And you can see with 90% of the response in the domestic arena with the National Guard, that's pretty telling that the nation needs it, wants it, demands it. Where not only have we been used in the last 10, 15, 20 years for natural disaster response, God, we had a dozen activations last year, and that's the average on activations. And last year was a relatively slow year for hurricanes and fires and things like that. Where a couple years before that, we had a lot more activity, and this year's looking like it might be a pretty significant year for events and activity. But having the option to do a lot of that for our nation, and then now we find the Guard can add a lot of depth and value to our medical community, who is under great stress for capacity, where the Guard and Reserve can add great capacity there. And then people are raising the question on how much do we want to have a full-time active duty presence back in garrison in the States, and then deployed overseas, and where's that balance? You look at history, and you look at where the British Empire was at the turn of the last century. It's dominant in presence. The flag never set over the Union Jack and the British flag. And that changed pretty dramatically in World War I and then into World War II, as they had a large percentage of their national resource spent on their military. And in the end, that evolved and changed to where we are. So the American public, with our pressures on the budget, is going to demand that we take a relook at this balance and where we are. And the Guard's ready with our capability, and building a strategic reserve, I think, will be of value to our nation for the long term. And the DoD is already starting to have these discussions. There's one more data point I'll give you. In the late 1950s, early 1960s, the nation, and specifically the Air Force, was in the process of building and enhancing the two of the legs of the triad for our nuclear defense. Huge amounts of money to go with a ground-based strategic defense, basically our silos and our missiles and our silos. And to pay for that, at that time in the early 60s, they took roughly about 40% of the force structure of the U.S. Air Force, were able to move that to the National Guard, at a cost of about 30 cents on the dollar, maintain the level of force structure they had, yet at the same time save 70% of the budget to pay for this recapitalization of the nuclear enterprise. And that's what I offer today, is to say, hey, as we go into the new high-end fight, as we start to touch the pressures of recapitalizing our nuclear deterrence and doing both, those are huge amounts of money, as we go there and into space as well. And I think the Guard can add value. Strategic defense, which is very cost effective. Operational defense, which does cost more, but if you do it the right way, the right balance, and not make it all full time, it can be a great way to save money, maintain the capacity of our force structure, while the active duty gets after the capability of 5th gen, 6th gen space, high-end fights, and then recapitalizing our nuclear enterprise.
Well, that's a great way to segue into the next topic I really wanted to talk a bit about, get your perspectives, and that's modernization. As you recognized and alluded to, COVID-19 costs are simply stunning and mounting. We're up to $6 trillion, and many are forecasting an abrupt change in defense funding as a result. The plus up of the Trump administration is over, period, dot. So how do you see the trans-COVID economy affecting overall Air Force modernization? And how is the Guard's posture going to fall out of that adjustment?
Right, and great question. And frankly, we're in discussions in the Department of Defense, and I don't have all the answers. But I have a sense for if a couple ifs, if you keep the defense budget the same percentage of the gross national product, and our GNP downsizes by 5, 10, 15, 20%, 25%, heaven forbid, that will definitely drive us somewhere into a recession and depression. And there's all indications that some of those are realistic projections, and some of them are crazy. So some sectors will be flourishing and some won't, but still we're getting ready, and we're tightening our belt and getting ready that if the GNP goes down, definitely the defense budget will at a minimum remain flat, if not go down. And we're going through drills on a 5, 10, 20% cut in the Department of Defense budget and real buying power. You know, how do we cope with that? And how do we drive into the future? And so this is a time when the relevance and the cost effectiveness of this balance between active and reserve component, including the Guard and reserve, is a great discussion now, because we could add great value. And so as we look to what we did in the late 50s and 60s, this is an opportunity for us to, hey, the Air Force has to keep capacity that we have now because of all the things we're doing across the world, and yet at the same time we have to increase the level of our capability, and that's the heart of where the Guard can add some value.
Okay, very good. Let's we've been talking about change that we didn't anticipate. Another big change that has been laid on the military here on the 20th of December of 2019 was the establishment of the Sixth Service, and that's the U.S. Space Force. There are a lot of issues that we could talk about, and I have with the Chief of Space Operations, as well as his deputy and several others. But one of the topics that is, I understand, still being discussed and developed is the issue of plans for a Space National Guard. Do you see this unfolding in a way that that's parallel to the other services? And if so, do you see a Space National Guard director at some point in the future equal in stature to your position?
I actually do, because there's been a push on one side. The negative side of it is, hey, we don't have the capital in our nation and our department to build this another layer of bureaucracy, in the order of magnitude of the Air Force, the Navy, and the Army and the Marine Corps. So hey, the Space Force is a subset of the Air Force, is effective way to minimize the size of the bureaucracy. But in light of those conversations, there's been talk about, hey, we don't have the money to establish a bureaucracy in all 54, the 50 states and territories and district, and create a Space Force and an overhead, because it would be cost prohibitive. In fact, there was a recent news article about, hey, it would be a roughly $100 to $150 million a year to add that overhead to the National Guard to do it. And right now, today, I have about 1,300, 1,400 guardsmen doing space operations now. And so those guardsmen don't need an overhead in 54 states and territories. We just need them in the 7 to 9 states that they're in. But it's such a small footprint on the size of our force that I established all the overhead there and on the national level to support all our space operations all at a time. And so, we already had people doing the planning, programming, budgeting, execution, mobilizing, and feeding the O&M, the ops, and maintenance, the tempo that they're doing. And they're doing multiple things, but I carved out their time and effort, and we built the overhead on it. So that 100 million overhead is up there. So that's the anti side of it. The positive side of it, though, is that the Space Force, and under DoD and Congress's direction, has been asked to, is now the time to look at a different reserve model and look across the world and see if other reserve models have been effective. And one thing some of the other nations do is they delegate the authority on hiring, firing, moving people in and out of active service, part-time service, to a service chief. And so that's a role and responsibility that Congress keeps in our nation. And so the Space Force has been looking at that, and I think they've got something there as they absorb the Air Force reserves and the space people that are doing that into the Space Force as an integral part of the service, so that the chief of space operations now has the authority, or doesn't have the authority now, but they're exploring the authority to absorb the reserves in one single component service and have full-time, part-time part of the Title 10, embedded in your organization and in your ranks. And there's some value in that. The thing that's missed with that, with a guard, is our Title 32 authorities to work for the governor. And God, it wasn't even 10 years ago that we talked about, well, we're building a cyber force, cybercom. Why do we need the National Guard in cyber? Because a governor, doesn't have solid lines in the world of cyber. The cyber does not see state lines. And so a governor doesn't need it. Well, thank goodness we did create that, because the authorities we're bringing to bear for the elections and all the mindset and DNA we're bringing out of our cyber professionals, we're using Title 32 authorities to support governors to help them build an enterprise that secures our elections. And I never would have thought of that 10 years ago, but when been used of great value, over the last few elections. So I don't know what the governors will use for space. I mean, I do know in Colorado, when the fire's burning and the trees are coming down, they do look to space to say, give me a picture, show me what's there, and a governor will ask for that. And that might be ways, but the biggest thing is the culture and mindset of a military professional that has one foot in Title 10 world to deploy, employ, run space operations, but the other foot in domestic operations, available at a drop of a hat to a governor to do things. We had 300 of our space professionals in California out there running, swab testing for COVID, and they were out there, and we put them on duty for about 45 to 60 days, and then we send them back to their civilian employers and back to ranks as we're rotating people through, running and manning our COVID testing. And that's been key to help in places like California and other states start to get back up on step and get their economy rolling again and get back into operation. So I see that there will be a Space National Guard. It will take time. The legislation part is easy. It's just a matter of Google searching and all where it says Air National Guard and add Air and Space National Guard. That will be easy to establish that. So that piece will be fine. And in fact, we're working with the Chief of Space Operations, Secretary of the Air Force, to present these ideas of a single service for the active and reserve under the Chief of Space Operations, and an additional reserve component from the National Guard. And we're going to present that to the Department of Defense, to the SecDef here soon, but that's the path that we're on right now.
Well, that's great insight, particularly considering the fact that the size of the Space Force, the introduction of not just the U.S. Space Force, but also Space Command, and then there are the components. So there's a lot of demand for personnel, and it makes a lot of sense, particularly given the stable nature of the space mission elements, or a good part of it. I also wanted to highlight the fact that it was a super example that you gave in the context of those that were pushing back on reserve and the guard forces in the cyber function. Folks that like to hold on to the status quo simply cannot foresee the changes that occur in the future. So thank you for introducing that as an example as well. Now, Scott, we've kind of come up on our time schedule here that we'd like to reserve to get some questions from the media and our audience who've been listening. So I want to thank you before we go there for your time and your insights. We certainly value the dialogue, and we certainly appreciate your thought leadership over not just your tenure as the director of the Air Guard, but 40 years of magnificent service. So on behalf of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies and all of AFA, we wish you and the Air National Guard all the best, and personally, I wish you all the best in your future endeavors.